Hello, I am Anshuman Bora, and I welcome you to this lecture on the topic Phenomenological Approach, which is part of the paper on oral history. Phenomenological approach is a perspective which places human experience, memory, and meaning making at the center of historical understanding. Phenomenology is a philosophical tradition which tries to understand how individuals perceive their world, how they interpret events, how they give meaning to their lived experiences. The term phenomenology comes from the Greek words phenomenon, which means that which appears, and logos, which means study. Hence, in a very simple form, phenomenology is a study of lived experience as it is experienced. The approach was first articulated by Edmund Husserl, who argued that modern scientific thinking often overlooks the richness of subjective life. He studied how emotions, perceptions, and reflections shape individuals inhabit their worlds. His ideas of intentionality, the life world, and epoche or bracketing form the core of phenomenological inquiry. Husserl's work was later expanded by his student Martin Heidegger, who shifted phenomenology from a description to interpretation, foregrounding the existential and historical dimensions of human life. Later scholars such as Merleau-Ponty, Ricoeur, and Gadamer further extended these insights and brought in embodiment, perception, and narrative. But it was Alfred Schutz who introduced phenomenology in the study of society. Schutz emphasized that social reality is constructed through shared meanings and typifications. He argued that people understand their world in relation to others, and this shared process of meaning making forms the basis of social life. His ideas deeply influenced the qualitative fields like ethnography, sociology, and oral history. This brings us to the heart of today's discussion. Phenomenology and oral history have a deep and powerful connection. Oral history itself is not just a simple record of the events, it's a space where people narrate their experiences, their emotions, their interpretations, and their inner worlds. Where conventional history often focuses on objective facts, phenomenology directs our attention to how the past was lived, felt, and understood by individuals and communities. So, in this sense, phenomenology enriches oral history by asking certain questions like how does the narrator perceive the past? What meanings do they attach to events? How do memories, emotion, and identity intertwine? How do interviews become shared spaces of meaning? These questions help oral historians avoid reducing testimonies to mere data and instead appreciate them as deeply personal and interpretive accounts of human experience. In this lecture, we will explore the core concepts of phenomenology, the theoretical intersections between phenomenology and oral history, the methodological implications for interview design and interpretation, and finally, the challenges and strengths of using phenomenology in oral historical research. Our goal is to understand how phenomenology helps oral history remain a humane, empathetic, and ethically grounded practice, which honors subjectivity, centers the lived experience, and preserves the depth and complexity of human stories. With this, let's begin by examining the core concepts of phenomenology, which helps give shape to its relationship with oral history. There are several foundational ideas, like intentionality, life world, bracketing, and intersubjectivity, which are very essential to interpret the lived experiences. These concepts shape how we listen, how we ask questions, and how we interpret the narratives which are shared in oral history interviews. Husserl's phenomenology begins with the insight that all consciousness is intentional. What this means is that human experience is never empty or isolated. It's always about something. When a narrator remembers an event, they not only recall facts, they also direct their consciousness towards the meaning of that event and how its emotions, implications, and its significance play a vital role in their life story. For oral history, intentionality reminds us that memories are not just passive recordings, they are active interpretations which are crafted around meaning, emotion, and reflection. Another fundamental idea of phenomenology is the concept of life world. It's the world as it is felt, perceived, and inhabited by individuals. The world of everyday lived experience before it is being analyzed or theorized. In oral history, the concept of life world gives a very powerful analytical tool. Oral historians does not only listen to what happened, but to how the narrator lived through it, how they made sense of it, and how it shaped the rhythms of their everyday life. The concept of life world, therefore, anchors oral history in experience rather than abstraction. A third core concept is epoche, which involves bracketing or suspending one's assumptions to understand the phenomenon as it appears to the participant. What this means in research is to set aside the preconceived ideas, judgments, or theoretical expectations so that the narrator's own perspective can emerge clearly. For oral history interviewing, this idea of bracketing therefore encourages open listening, non judgment, suspension of bias, and respecting the narrator's worldview. It helps the historian create a space where the participants can express their experiences in their own terms. Phenomenology also gives emphasis on intersubjectivity, which is the shared world created through interaction between individuals. Every oral history interview is an intersubjective encounter. Here, two consciousnesses meet: the narrator, who brings memories, emotions, and meaning, and the interviewer, who brings curiosity, empathy, and intersection. In this shared space, meaning is co constructed. The interview is thus not a neutral, extractive act. Rather, it's a relational process where understanding emerges through dialogue. Also, drawing from the ideas of Alfred Schutz, phenomenology shows us that individuals interpret the world using typifications. It uses shared social categories, meanings, and expectations when structuring experience. What this means is that when someone narrates the past, they rely on familiar social meanings to make sense of events. These typifications help shape what they emphasize, how they frame their story, and how they interpret their own identity. This is crucial for oral history because the historian also has to be alert and listen for these shared meanings and understand the cultural frameworks which shape memory. Later phenomenologists, especially Merleau-Ponty, gave emphasis on the concept of embodiment. That is, the idea that experience is lived through the body and the senses. Embodiment has a profound relevance in oral history. It reminds us that memory is shaped by sensation, movement, trauma, physical presence, and emotional resonance. Narrators often feel the past as they tell it. These core concepts of intentionality, the life world, epoche, intersubjectivity, typification, and embodiment form the philosophical foundation of the phenomenological approach. They help shift our focus from what happened to how it was experienced, how meaning was constructed, and how individuals place themselves within the flow of memory and time. With this conceptual grounding, let's now try to understand how phenomenology intersects with oral history theory and practice. Phenomenology helps to transform oral history from a method of data collection into profound engagement with lived experience, memory, and meaning. Phenomenology asks us not to merely document what happened, but also to understand how individuals experience their lives, their emotions, interpretations, and sense of identity. Oral history, when viewed through this lens, becomes an encounter with personal worlds which is shaped by memory and embodied meaning. At its very heart, phenomenology gives emphasis on what is called Erlebnis, which is German for lived experience. Oral history is very uniquely suited to capture this characteristic of phenomenology. When a narrator speaks about the past, they do not simply recount events, they also reveal how they lived through those events, how they felt it, how they made sense to them, and how these experiences also shaped their identity. This alignment makes phenomenology a natural partner for oral history. Oral history thus becomes a window to look into the lived experiences of individuals. Memory is also not a storage system. Rather, it's an interpretive act. Memories change over time. This is because they're shaped by later events, by social context, and by the narrator's evolving sense of the self. Phenomenology helps us recognize that what narrators remember is intertwined with their ideas of meaning, identity, emotion, and personal perspective. This helps shift the historian's task from just verifying facts to also trying to understand how individuals can construct meaning from their lived experience. Phenomenology also insists that experience is never purely individual. Rather, it is shaped in relation to others. In oral history, this creates the concept of the shared interview space. When two individuals meet, two life forms interact, and two consciousnesses co create meaning. Therefore, the interview is not just a neutral extraction. It's a dialogue. It's a moment of intersubjective exchange where understanding develops dynamically between the narrator and the interviewer. Meaning, therefore, arises between people, not only within them. Phenomenological oral history also has a temporal depth. This is because when narrators speak, they navigate multiple layers of time. These layers include the moment of the original experience, the later moments of remembering, and the present moment of narration. This triple layered temporality shows how individuals continually reconstruct the past in relation to the present. Phenomenology helps encourage the oral historians to listen for these layers and recognize how meaning evolves as life unfolds. Phenomenology also emphasizes the embodied nature of experience. People feel their past and they carry it in their gestures, tone, emotion, and even physical presence. So when the narrators speak, their bodies and voices are actively shaping the meaning. Phenomenology helps us to understand this depth of expression as part of the historical record. It can thus be said that the body remembers even when the mind hesitates. A very crucial ethical dimension is also added to oral history by phenomenology. The narrators are not mere sources, they are subjects of lived experience. Therefore, the historian has to show empathy, respect, patience, and a genuine openness to the worldview of the narrator. Phenomenology insists that each person's experience deserves careful ethical attention without imposing any external interpretation. Narrative is not simply a way of reporting the past, it's a way of constructing the world. When people tell stories, they are also organizing their experience in meaningful sequences. Phenomenology helps oral historians recognize that the structure of the narrative, its pauses, emphasis, shifts, and reflections all reveal how the narrator makes sense of their lives. Thus, the story itself is the meaning. Phenomenology and oral history therefore intersect at the level of lived experience. Phenomenology gives oral historians a philosophical foundation to understanding memory, meaning, emotion, temporality, and intersubjective connection. It encourages us to see that the interview is not just a method of extracting facts, it's a space where human experience is shared, interpreted, and honored. Let us now understand the methodological implications and explore how phenomenology has helped shape and practice of oral history interviewing, listening, and interpretation. Phenomenological oral history is not just a technique, it's a stance, it's a way of approaching the narrator with openness, attentiveness, and a commitment to understanding lived experience. Phenomenology asks us to listen differently, to ask questions differently, and to interpret narrations more deeply. A phenomenological interview has to be guided by experience based prompts, not through rigid questionnaires. What this means is to avoid strictly structured or leading questions. Rather, narrators have to be invited to reflect on what they felt, what they perceived, how they interpreted the events, and how the experience shaped them. The interviewer has to create an open space where the participants can explore the memories in their own words and rhythms. The aim here is not to extract facts, it's to reveal the lived meaning. The concept of bracketing, that is, suspending all assumptions, is also essential during interviewing. This requires the interviewer to set aside any prior interpretations, suspend judgment, and hold back from categorizing, and listen to the narration with openness. Bracketing helps ensure the narrator's lived world is not overshadowed by the interviewer's expectations. This is not neutrality, it's intentional humility. A phenomenological interview also recognizes the encounter as an intersubjective relationship. Rapport is not superficial friendliness, it's the creation of a shared space which is built on respect, trust, and attentiveness. Here it has to be stressed that rapport also enables the narrators to speak freely, to access deeper layers of memory, and to articulate emotions which might otherwise remain unspoken. Rapport allows meaning to emerge in the relational space between the interviewer and narrator. In a phenomenological interview, the goal of the interviewer is to draw out rich, textured descriptions of lived experience. The narrator has to be gently guided towards reflecting on how the events felt, how they were interpreted, and how they shaped identity. This process involves using several prompts, like, for example, can you describe what that moment was like for you? How did you experience that situation at the time? What did it mean to you then? And what does it mean now? Questions like these deepen the interview and also highlight the inner world of the narrator. As mentioned before, memory is also layered across time. Therefore, the interviewer has to be alert and listen for the triple layered temporality, which is how individuals continually reconstruct the past in relation to the present. Phenomenology helps teach us to pay attention to these shifts, to understand how the narrator moves between the past and the present, and how meaning has evolved across time. This helps oral historians recognize that memory is dynamic, not fixed. Phenomenological oral history requires the interviewer to attend not only to words, but also to the embodied expression of memory. Embodied cues like emotion, tone, hesitation, gesture, and bodily presence may contribute to the meaning of the narrative. These cues also help reveal certain unresolved feelings, deep resonance, vulnerability, or significance which may otherwise have not be verbally articulated. Thus, in phenomenology, the body is also a site of memory. Phenomenological analysis also tries to seek the essence of experience, which forms the underlying structure of meaning that appears across narration. This requires moving beyond categorization or thematic coding and engaging instead with the fullness of the narrator's world. A holistic interpretation includes attending to context, understanding subjective meaning, reading the emotional tone, and recognizing the narrator's self understanding. This approach also helps preserve the integrity of lived experience. Phenomenological oral history also has to be written with ethical sensitivity. It has to reflect the narrator's experience faithfully and without distortion. This includes careful representation, avoidance of overgeneralization, respect for subjective truths, and transparency about interpretation. The historian therefore becomes a steward of lived experience. Phenomenology therefore transforms oral history into an empathetic, relational, and deeply interpretative practice. It shapes not only how we interview, but how we listen, how we interpret, and how we honor the lived worlds of those who speak. Phenomenology, therefore, gives a very rich and meaningful way to understand the lived experience through oral history. But this approach also has a certain set of significant challenges. These challenges arise from the interpretive nature of phenomenology, the complexity of memory, and the ethical responsibilities which are involved in representing personal experience. These difficulties do not diminish the value of phenomenology. However, it will remind us that such work requires patience, sensitivity, and a deep awareness of our own positionality as researchers. A central challenge is the unavoidable presence of subjectivity. In phenomenological oral history, the narrator interprets experience, and the researcher interprets that interpretation. This creates multiple layers of subjectivity. It involves subjective memory, subjective narration, subjective listening, and subjective interpretation. Phenomenology embraces subjectivity, but also demands rigorous self awareness to avoid imposing the researcher's meanings onto the narrator's lived world. The challenge, therefore, is not to remove subjectivity, but to understand and reflect upon it. Phenomenological research is also slow and demanding. Interviews are longer, interpretation is deeper, and analysis requires careful reading and rereading of transcripts to identify the essence of experience. This depth cannot be rushed. It requires immersion in the narrator's world and a sustained commitment to understanding meaning in a holistic way. Memory itself also introduces complexity. As memories evolve over time, they are also influenced by later experiences, current emotions, and the circumstances of the interview. Thus, for the researcher, this raises certain important questions like how do we interpret the memories which shift over time? How do we recognize the layers of temporality in the narrative? How to distinguish between recollection and interpretation? Therefore, phenomenology teaches us that these complexities are not errors. They are part of the lived texture of remembering, but they demand careful, reflective analysis. Another major challenge is language. Narrators may often struggle to express deep experience in words, and researchers also may struggle to capture the subtle meanings when translating or transcribing. Language may also obscure the emotional nuance, embodied memory, culturally specific expressions, or the narrator's inner perspective. Phenomenological oral history does require sensitivity to these limitations and a willingness to listen beyond literal wording. This is because meaning often lies between the words. Phenomenological interviews can also evoke deep emotional memories. Therefore, these moments have to be navigated with care and respect. It's a process which involves protecting the narrator's well being, respecting the emotional boundaries, and maintaining empathy without crossing into intrusion. The ethical challenge lies in balancing the desire for meaningful insight with the responsibility to safeguard the dignity and emotional safety of the narrator. Another challenge here is to balance individual experience with broader historical context. Phenomenology focuses on personal meaning, while history tries to seek larger patterns and structures. The challenge, therefore, is how we can honor subjective experience without losing sight of historical forces. And conversely, another challenge is how we can contextualize experience without reducing it to a footnote of history. Hence, phenomenological oral history requires a careful, balanced approach which recognizes both personal depth and social context. There is also a possibility of reading too much into the narrator's words. As phenomenology invites deep interpretation, it also carries a risk of attributing meanings which a narrator never even intended. These challenges remind researchers to stay grounded in the actual narrative, rely on what is said and shown, and avoid projecting personal theories onto lived experience. Interpretation must therefore illuminate, not overshadow. The challenges of phenomenological oral history are thus substantial. These challenges include interpretative subjectivity, time demands, emotional complexity, linguistic limitations, and keeping the delicate balance between personal meaning and historical context. However, these challenges are not weaknesses. They remind us that human experience is intricate, layered, and profoundly meaningful. Now that we have acknowledged the challenges, let's conclude the lecture and reflect on why phenomenology is a valuable and transformative approach within oral history. Phenomenology invites us to shift our focus from the events themselves to how these events were lived, experienced, interpreted, and remembered by individuals. It gives us a reminder that history is not only what happened, it's also how people make sense of what happened, how the events inhabit their memories, how they narrate their identities, and how they understand themselves in relation to others and to time. Through concepts like intentionality, the life world, bracketing, intersubjectivity, and embodiment, phenomenology has provided oral historians a vocabulary and framework to engage deeply with lived experience. These concepts help us recognize that memory is not just a record, it's an interpretive process which is dynamic, emotional, and inseparable from the narrator's present self. Phenomenology also enriches oral history by teaching us to listen differently. It encourages attentiveness, ethical sensitivity, and an openness to the narrator's worldview. Rather than reducing testimony to data, it urges us to honor the fullness, the texture, and the humanity of the story being shared. We also reflected on the theoretical intersections between phenomenology and oral history. We studied how oral history has become a space of lived meaning and layered temporality, how narrative has emerged as a form of understanding, and how the interview has become a shared, intersubjective encounter where meaning is co created. Methodologically, the phenomenological approach has challenged us to design interviews which privilege experience over fact and suspend assumptions, build genuine rapport, and listen for emotional tone, bodily expression, and narrative shifts. It teaches us to interpret stories holistically and seek the essence of experience without imposing our own categories or overshadowing the narrator's voice. At the same time, we also acknowledged the challenges of this approach. Challenges are caused by the depth of interpretive subjectivity, the time required for careful analysis, the complexity of memory, the constraints of language, and the ethical responsibility to handle personal stories with care. These challenges, however, are not shortcomings. They're reminders that human experience is rich, layered, and profoundly personal. By bringing everything together, we can say that phenomenology has given oral history a powerful intellectual and ethical orientation. It has encountered historians to approach narrators not as sources, but as individuals whose lived experiences carry meaning, perspective, emotion, and identity. It teaches us to value subjectivity rather than dismiss it, and to see the personal world of a narrator as a legitimate and vital sign of historical knowledge. Ultimately, the phenomenological approach reminds us that oral history is not just a method of recovering the past, it's a deeply human encounter. It's a meaning of life force, an act of shared interpretation, and a commitment to understanding the lived realities behind memory and narrative. It allows history to remain connected to the everyday, to the personal, and to the profoundly human. Thank you.